One of the strangest things I discovered after moving to America wasn't anything that you see in the news. It wasn't the things people argue about online. And it wasn't even the fact that you can buy a lawnmower, a birthday cake, and a six pack all in the same store. It was standing in line, which sounds ridiculous of all the cultural differences between Australia and the US. Surely a queue isn't one of them. But standing in line was where I first realized Australians and Americans often read the same situation very differently.
You better take cover.
In Australia, if you're standing in line at the supermarket and a stranger is next to you, there's a pretty good chance absolutely nothing will happen. You stand there, they stand there. You both stare vaguely at the chewing gum on display. Maybe you glance at the magazine rack. Oh, look, Harry and Megs are on the front cover again. Maybe you pretend to be fascinated by the price of Duracell batteries. No one says anything. And nobody thinks it's weird either. In fact, if someone suddenly turned to you and said, "G'day, mate, how's your day going?" there would be a small moment of panic. You'd immediately start running through possibilities. Do I know this guy? I mean, have we met before? Did I accidentally make eye contact for too long? Australians generally see silence as respectful. We're giving each other space. It's our way of saying, "G'day, mate, I see you. Carry on." That's the unspoken agreement. We're both here. We're both just waiting to pay and leave. And that's what I grew up with. But then I moved to America, and more specifically, I moved to Tennessee. And when I first moved here, I'd stand in line and somebody would start talking every single time. At first I thought, maybe it's a coincidence. Then I thought, well, maybe I looked like I was just very approachable. Kind of like a poor man's version of Guy Fieri or Larry Bird. But then after the 500th conversation, I realized this was simply normal. An American can start a conversation with absolutely anyone. The person in front of them, the person behind them, the cashier, the security guard, the dog tied up outside. No one's safe. And at first, I really couldn't work it out. Like, why was everybody talking to strangers? But over time, I've realized something pretty important. They're not making conversation for a reason. The conversation was the reason. Australians often show consideration by leaving people alone. Americans often show consideration by including people. It's the same goal, but it's a different method. And I think that's where some of the misunderstandings tend to come from. Because Americans can sometimes see Aussies as a little bit cold. And Australians can sometimes see Americans as a tad overwhelming. But we're both trying to be friendly. We're just operating by completely different social rules. One comment on the channel recently really summed it up perfectly. I had an American viewer, and they said that when they see somebody standing quietly by themselves, they almost feel drawn to them. Their instinct is to go over and make conversation, help them feel included, make them feel comfortable. Now, to an Aussie, that same person looks perfectly comfortable already. We're thinking, like, why would you want to go and interrupt them? But the American is thinking, why would you leave them standing there by themselves? Now, look, neither side is wrong. They're just interpreting the same situation in different ways. And living here in the States, you see it everywhere. Checkout lines, sporting events, waiting for the bus, even at the doctor's office. I once had somebody strike up a conversation while I was waiting for a prescription at Walgreens. Now, I've had conversations pumping gas, conversations standing in line to pick up a pizza. And at this point, if somebody doesn't start to talk to me in public, I honestly start wondering if I forgot to shower. The South takes this to an entirely different level. I've lived in Tennessee for about 8 years now. Southern friendliness is almost a superpower. You can walk into a store and leave knowing the life story of three strangers. People ask where you're from, how long you've been here, what brought you to town. And somehow none of it feels strange because they're genuinely interested. I think that's the part that a lot of visitors here often miss out on. Because in many countries, asking personal questions can sometimes feel like an interrogation. But in America, it's usually an invitation. They're saying, tell me about yourself, not justify yourself. And those are very different things. One question that surprised me was how often I'm asked, what do you do for work? Now, depending upon where you're from, that can feel like somebody is trying to work out where you fit into social hierarchy. But I'm learning that Americans generally don't mean it that way. They're looking for a conversation starter, a connection point, something to build on. Again, it's the same words, but it's a different meaning. The more I've lived here, the more I've started to see a pattern. Americans seem incredibly good at making interactions really easy. It could be a quick smile or a compliment, a joke, a random conversation, maybe a little encouragement. Someone shared with me a story recently that really hit home. A woman in Arkansas, she told me there'd been a major accident on the interstate. Traffic was stopped for hours, and people got out of their cars. They started talking to strangers, walked around, shared stories. It was almost like a community barbecue event. And by the time the road reopened, some people had actually become so distracted chatting, they couldn't remember where they parked their cars. Yeah, to an Aussie, that's probably one of the most American stories I think I've heard. I love it. But it is a way of letting people know that they're welcome. And once I started seeing it that way, a lot of those random conversations that you think are a little bit strange really start to make a lot more sense. An American friend once told me that if we're talking, we know we're okay. And I think there's a fair bit of truth in that. Conversation creates certainty. It tells people that they're welcome, that everything's fine. No one's being left out. Australians, we can be almost the opposite at times. If we're standing quietly together, we know we're okay. We don't tend to feel the need to fill in every gap. In fact, filling every gap can sometimes create awkwardness where none existed before. And that's one of those cultural differences that's hard to explain until you've actually lived it. There's never approach is better. They're just different. And there's one thing people often get wrong about Australians. We're friendly, but we're often just that little bit more reserved than what people think. Americans often communicate comfort through openness. And the funny thing is that after living here for years now, I've started changing. I catch myself doing it now. I'll be standing somewhere and suddenly I'm the one that's talking to a stranger. Sometimes I don't even realize that it's happened, but over time, I've become one of them. The real test came when I visited Australia again. So I was standing in line somewhere and I realized that nobody was talking. Nobody. The silence was just incredible. There was a whole queue of people standing there quietly. And for the first time, probably in my life, it felt really strange. I caught myself thinking, someone should probably say something. And that's when I knew that America had gotten to me. Because the truth is, one of the things I've come to admire most about Americans is how willing they are to engage with people. Is there's an optimism underneath it, a belief that the stranger next to you might be interesting, might be worth talking to, could even become a friend. And one comment on the channel recently said, Americans are basically like golden retrievers. Honestly, that's probably not the worst description that I've ever heard. Because I think Americans tend to approach the world assuming people are worth talking to. Whereas Australians at times approach the world assuming people probably want to be left alone. And both approaches have strengths, but I think they also both have weaknesses too. So if you are coming to America for a trip or to work or to live here, understanding this difference will save you a lot of confusion to start with. That person talking to you in line at Publix isn't trying to invade your privacy. The cashier at Walmart asking questions isn't being nosy. Most of the time, they're simply doing what Americans seem to do, making contact, creating a connection, and trying to make the world feel that little bit less anonymous. I think once you understand that, something interesting starts to happen. Is what initially feels exhausting actually starts to feel warm. And what initially feels strange, it feels normal. And then before long, you're standing in line at the supermarket discussing barbecue recipes with a complete stranger, while the Australians back home wonder what on earth happened to you. Probably the moment then that you realise you've been in America for a while. Hooroo, mateys.
You better take cover.